So welcome back. We're going to talk about World War II this week. Last week we discussed the First World War as what I called a total war. As such, as a total war, during World War I, the U.S. government took extraordinary measures to wage war on what was at the time an unprecedented scale. And that total war included increased surveillance of Americans, even those who exercised their First Amendment rights. There were crackdowns on free speech, free press, freedom of assembly. And yet, 2 decades after the end of the First World War, a Second World War would throw the world into chaos once again. This time, though, the magnitude of World War II would dwarf the First World War in every conceivable way. The Second World War is unique in world history, and it remains unique. And it entailed one of the most controversial actions ever taken by the U.S. government and military, and we'll talk about that today. And this controversial method was done in the interest of national security, of internal security, of ferreting out potential subversives. So this time we'll start with the narrative leading up to the war against imperialism in Asia and against fascism in Europe. We'll discuss the methods of waging war and the domestic impact of the war. And of course, as part of that domestic impact, we'll talk about the growth of the surveillance state in wartime. So let's start with the road to World War II. So of course, as you know, World War II was fought on multiple fronts. And it would be Japan, unexpectedly, it would be Japan that brought the United States into the war. American leaders, interventionists, expected that their first foe would be Germany. But in fact, it would be Japan. So a bit of context on that. Japan, since the late 1800s, had been growing industrially and militarily. And you see Japan there on the map. It's a pretty small island chain, and it's one not rich in resources needed to fuel their industry and military growth. And so the Japanese military and governments over that time were very much interested in expanding their empire. And so as an example of this, in 1931, Japan captures a region in China called Manchuria. You see it on the map. And they targeted this region in particular because it was rich in resources. And this wouldn't be the first time that China and Japan were at war. You may also note on the map that Japan had already occupied Korea and had been doing so for a couple decades by this point. As you also see on the map, they occupy Manchuria and rename it Manchukuo. Toward the end of the decade of the 1930s, all-out war breaks out between Japan and China. This is the so-called Second Sino-Japanese War. So at this point, China is an ally of the United States. And the U.S. is looking warily at the aggression of the Japanese in the Pacific. And the U.S. has some leverage over the Japanese. The U.S. provides 80% of Japan's oil supply, which of course is necessary in fueling their industry and military growth. We'll return to Japan in a few moments. Just to give you a hint of what Japan is up to at the time and why it would be a major player in the Second World War. As we saw last time, the First World War would lead to the emergence of a communist state, the Soviet Union, which was solidified in 1922 after revolution and civil war. Remember, it was that revolution that forced Russia to exit to exit World War I early, then eventually those series of revolutions and that civil war culminated in the establishment of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, USSR, or Soviet Union, in 1922. In 1924, a man by the name of Joseph Stalin, pictured there, rises to power in the Soviet Union, and he is he is possibly the worst mass murderer in all of human history, certainly in the 20th century, because he would be in power for almost 30 years. And he would oversee a totalitarian state. We'll talk more about what that means in a moment in a different context. But this Soviet Union was expansionist. Russia had given up territory in the treaty that ended its involvement in World War I. And when the leadership of Russia at the time was criticized for giving up territory, their message was, well, we'll get it back. And sure enough, they would. And they set their sights on other territories as well. It was autocratic, authoritarian, totalitarian, and imperialistic, the Soviet Union. It too would be a major player in the Second World War. A significant development on the road to World War II is the emergence of a new ideology in Europe, fascism. Now, there are some who say fascism emerged in Italy, Nazism emerged in Germany. There are some who say they're two sides of the same coin. There's some who say they're different, but we'll use them interchangeably here. Fascism emerges in Italy first. Adolf Hitler, who establishes the Nazi regime in Germany, is an admirer of fascism in Italy. And there are several similarities, as we'll see on this slide, as we describe what this ideology entails. So in a fascist state, totalitarianism is the rule. They are under a dictatorship. Usually around this dictator, a very fervent cult of personality emerges, where there's this charismatic leader who captivates people with his speaking and has a very close circle of loyal people. And they are head of one party, and it's that party that dominates political life. In Italy, it's the fascist party. In Germany, it will be the Nazi party. We're not going to talk about Spain, but there was also a revolution in Spain in the 1930s that culminated in the emergence of a fascist rule there as well. So if you look at the word totalitarian, see the root of the word is total. So that's what the root of the word hints at this totalitarian means, is that the government seeks complete control over its population. What books go in the library, what plays are put on, what the stories that the press produces, and so on. They demand complete obedience from their people. They have no tolerance for dissent, for freedom of speech, for freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition. Obedience, unquestioning obedience, is demanded. And of course, when it's not given, when that obedience is not given, there are harsh consequences. Fascism, Nazism are intensely nationalistic, intense pride in their nation. And in this ideology, this pride in one's nation and one's people is very much rooted in racial pride. Fascists are militaristic and imperialistic. One of the first tasks these powerful dictators do is build their military, force discipline, and send that military out to acquire new territories. And in this case, they actually glorify war. Now, maybe today we're more accustomed to treating war as a necessary evil or something done only in self-defense. Fascists embraced war, celebrated war, glorified war, saw it as a way for human beings to prove themselves, to show their mettle, and to the victor goes the spoils. They assume, these fascists and Nazis, they assume that the most racially superior group will come out on top in these contests between nations and races. Of course, if this is a totalitarian state, a dictatorship, governed by a single party, these groups are hostile to democracy, hostile to socialism and communism as well. Now, oftentimes there is confusion that Joseph Stalin's rule in the Soviet Union sounds a lot like fascism. And to be fair, the Soviet Union, as I said, was a totalitarian state. It was nationalistic, it was militaristic and imperialistic, but there are some subtle differences. Whereas fascists see the world in terms of conflict between nations and races, communists see the world in terms of conflict between the classes, social, economic classes. This other point, of course, communist rulers are not hostile to communism, not hostile to socialism. When in Germany Hitler takes over the Nazi Party, he purges the socialists in its ranks. It's hostile. Hitler called socialism, called communism, a worldwide Jewish conspiracy. So there he is conflating his sense of competition among the races and conflating that with ideological differences. This last point is also another difference between fascism and communism. In a communist state, labor groups have some sway, and the government controls the economy. Now that's changing today. Even existing communist states today, China is very much embedded in the free market today. Just go shop at Walmart and you'll see that. But in these early days of communist states, the economy was controlled. In Germany and Italy, they were much more friendly to corporations and hostile to organized labor. When I say they're corporatist, what I mean is that they allow collusion between businesses in the same industry, whether it's to set wages, whether it's to shut out unions, whether it is to negotiate contracts. They allow cartels to form. Something like that is illegal in the United States. And this hostility to labor, this corporatism, encouraged many American companies to do business with Hitler's Germany, Ford Motor Company, IBM, Coca-Cola, and so on. So this is an ideology that emerges in Europe in the 1920s and 30s. It emerges in part in response to the outcome of the First World War and the disappointment in Italy and Germany with the outcome of those wars. Now, Italy was on the winning side, but there were many who were disappointed with the fact that Italy did not win many of the spoils, did not acquire a great bounty in new territory coming out of World War I. Germany, of course, was on the losing side and would have to suffer under a pretty harsh treaty, the Treaty of Versailles. And the post-World War I world is also marked by the Great Depression in the 20s and 30s. So economic hardship combined with discontent coming out of World War I would help create the conditions for the rise of fascism in Europe. One more point before I move on here. In a totalitarian state, how do you maintain obedience? Right? Whether people can't help but think for themselves. Well, of course, this obedience is forced, because disobedience, the consequences are unthinkable. These are police states. People are monitored. So when a democracy or a freer society engages in surveillance of its citizens or reduction of civil liberties, those critics will refer to these examples as cautionary examples. Even if in most cases it's an exaggeration, this is like the surveillance state run amok. And the same can be said for communist states as well. So fascism would emerge in Italy under the leadership of Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was a former socialist. He was a journalist, a poet, and a former member of Italy's Socialist Party, but he was kicked out of the Socialist Party because Mussolini favored Italy entering World War I, whereas the Socialist Party was opposed to Italy's involvement. So he was kicked out of the party, embittered, started a party of his own, the Fascist Party, which is a shortening of a longer name that translated means the League of Combat. So you can see their appetite for war is right there in their name. And the Fascist Party in Italy rises to the forefront of their politics through thuggery, by attacking striking workers, by destroying the offices of labor unions and socialist groups, some radical groups, all with the message that the fascists will return Italy to law and order. Italy was in a state of disarray, frequent overturn governments, and there was quite a bit of worry, especially among the middle class, especially among landowners. And so somebody promising law and order with an iron fist was seen as a welcome change. And so in 1922, Mussolini and his black shirts, you see them in the picture to the left, march on Rome, Italy's capital. And this show of strength persuades the King of Italy to appoint Mussolini prime minister. And from that position, he would seize greater power. Mussolini's efforts would grab the attention of Adolf Hitler. Hitler was actually born in Austria. Then he went to Germany as a young man. He tried to make it as a painter. He was a failed painter. Mussolini a failed poet. Hitler a failed painter. So if you have any struggling artist friends, make sure to be nice to them. Hitler, even though he was born in Austria, volunteered for the German army in World War I and served in World War I fighting with the Germans. He was wounded a couple times, was decorated for his service. When Germany surrenders and signs the peace, Hitler is actually convalescing from a wound. He's actually temporarily blinded. But he was shocked, appalled, disgusted with Germany's surrender. He believed that the history of civilization is forged through war, through conflict, and Germany's surrender was a betrayal to the German people. So remember, the World War I ends in 1918. After the war, he gets involved in party politics, and he rebrands an existing party, the Nazi Party. Now, in 1922, as we just saw, Mussolini takes power in Italy, and Hitler tries to follow that example. And he helps organize an effort in 1923 to overthrow the German government. This is known as the Beer Hall Putsch. Putsch is the German word for coup. It fails, though, and Hitler and other conspirators are thrown in prison. But Hitler and the others actually get a very light sentence. You might think that trying to overthrow the government might lead to a stiff penalty, but no. It turns out that many judges in Germany were hostile to the regime in place and sympathetic to the right-wing opponents like the Nazis. While Hitler was in prison, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, in which he lays out his vision for the world, his vision of the races, that there are superior races, master races. Of course, he is a part of. He calls them Aryans, the Aryan race. And there's this hierarchy of races beneath the Aryans. And at the bottom, he places the Jews. So remember what I said, one of the characteristics of this emerging ideology is that this intense nationalism is rooted in race, a sense of race. So Hitler would be released from prison. He has his book under his belt, and he re-engages with the Nazi Party and decides that Mussolini's method isn't going to work in Germany. He tried it and it failed, so they're going to have to work to build a base of support from the local level up. Then in the late 20s, the Great Depression hits, and Germany is one of the hardest hit countries in the world. As a point of comparison, in the United States, at its worst, the unemployment rate got up to 25%. In Germany, at its worst, the unemployment got up to 40%. So there were a great many unemployed, disaffected young men who are receptive to Hitler's message and the message of the Nazis, that they will restore law and order, a sense of pride. And also, in tough times, demagogues, like Adolf Hitler, often make hay by giving people a scapegoat to blame. And the scapegoat was the Jews. Even though Jews were a tiny minority of Germany's population, this long simmering anti-Semitism in Europe and in Germany reached a new level under Hitler. And so he promises to restore pride and law and order and security and find someone to blame. The Nazis begin to win some victories in electoral politics. And so Hitler is a figure on the rise. January 1933, the president of Germany appoints Hitler chancellor. And he does this with the encouragement of actually people in opposing parties who feel as if Hitler can be manipulated. But of course that would be their last mistake. Now I should specify, because there's a lot of misunderstanding surrounding this, is that the Nazis, even when during election time they engaged in the most brutal intimidation and violence in their efforts to sway elections, they never won a majority in Germany's Reichstag, which is the name for their legislature. They never won a majority. But Hitler becomes chancellor in a coalition government, and several crises would ensue that would allow him to consolidate his power. The month after he became chancellor, an incident of arson occurs at the Reichstag building. This is where the German legislature meets. And on the heels of this, Hitler capitalizes on the panic after the fire. He exploits people's legitimate fears. Turns out the fire was set by a communist dissident. They capture him, execute him. Some have called this what is sometimes referred to as a false flag attack, where they suspect that Hitler set the fire himself in order to get what he wanted. There's no evidence of that. In fact, the evidence points to the man who was actually punished for the crime. But regardless, the Reichstag fire leads to the Reichstag fire decree, which allows for the suspension of civil liberties and allows detention without trial. And so with this power in hand, the Nazis can now run roughshod over their political opponents. Now, I should note that this decree may seem out of bounds, and why on earth would somebody do this? It actually wasn't uncommon in post-World War I Germany under previous governments for them frequently to declare these kinds of emergencies and have these temporary periods in which the government assumes greater power. And of course, at this point in history, Hitler is not the Hitler we know. There are more mistakes to come. The following month, the Enabling Act goes into effect. And what does this do? It gives the Chancellor, Hitler, the power to enact laws without the legislature. Now, talk about a lawmaking body abdicating its responsibility. It's like, no, Chancellor, you make all the laws. And we all know what Hitler does with this power. He builds a militaristic regime, enforces loyalty, builds a base of support, sometimes through actual policy. Germany would recover from the Great Depression faster than some nations, and so that helped him win support, but also through propaganda. This poster here is from a documentary film, a piece of propaganda called Triumph of the Will, which captures a party meeting in the city of Nuremberg, and ends with a rousing Hitler speech. Having gatherings like this. Now imagine, in this case, say there's someone who lives in this neighborhood and says, Hitler can go to hell, I'm not going to his rally. What do you think might happen to that person? They would be locked up, brutalized in some way, intimidated in some way, forced to go, or imprisoned, maybe killed. This is a society in which if somebody, just a regular passerby, was walking down the street and they didn't salute a member of the Nazi Party, a member of their state police, they could be beaten right there on the street, and there would be no consequences for the person beating them. They're also after getting people young. They established the Hitler Youth, which is like a demented Boy Scouts, where boys, and you see there they are, quite young, are indoctrinated into Nazism at a very young age. There's also a League for German Girls, and that poster in the corner is from the League of German Girls. Now that's a that picture looks like it belongs on like a box of Hostess cupcakes or something. But no, this was nothing less than indoctrination to ensure several generations of loyalty. But what happens when that loyalty doesn't come? There is the state police, or the Gestapo, which is there to ensure loyalty to, and of course they're using the rhetoric that you would expect: keep law and order, maintain the glory of the state. But the Gestapo is brutal. They're to punish anyone questioning Hitler's power and the place of the Nazis. So this is a police state. What would happen to some of those people punished? The first concentration camp opens at Dachau in 1933. Now, to be clear, this is not Dachau at this point. It's not a death camp. The Holocaust has not begun yet. There is persecution of the Jews, but the attempted extermination of the Jews has not begun. This Dachau concentration camp is mainly a place to keep political prisoners and force them to do hard labor. Now, Dachau would be converted later on into a camp for mass death. Of course, the Holocaust would ensue later on. And this map points out where concentration camps emerged, death camps emerged. And not just in Germany, as you see, but also in the states that Germany conquered. We'll talk about those conquests in a moment. Now, in this police state, there were some groups targeted more than others. There were some groups monitored more than others. Some groups persecuted more than others. Of course, in Hitler's Germany, it was the Jews. Among the most infamous measures were the Nuremberg laws of 1935. This was a series of laws specifically targeting German Jews. For example, just to give you a few of these laws, it became a crime for a Jew to marry an Aryan, somebody who's, according to them, in the master race, who's racially superior. It became a crime for Jews to work in the civil service, work for the government. If a German Jew left the country, they were not allowed back in. And when they left the country, a large portion of their money would be seized. They can only take so much with them. This image on the slide here is a summary of the different categories, and you see to the right side of the screen there's the category for Jews and how the laws apply to them. Now, beyond the legal codes, there were, of course, more direct measures. The night of November 9th through 10th, 1938, something occurred known as Kristallnacht, which translated means Night of Broken Glass. Now, on this night, Nazi thugs roamed German towns and cities, destroying German businesses, storefronts, places of worship, homes and attacking Jews. Some 100 were killed that night. Hundreds were deported or arrested and sent to concentration camp. And to add insult to injury, after Kristallnacht, the Nazis passed a law making the Jews responsible for paying for the damage of Kristallnacht. So these are the dangers of a surveillance state run amok. They can scapegoat and target particular groups, seize their property, deprive them of the rights of citizens, and sometimes outright assault and kill them. Now, these were all internal policies and actions in Nazi Germany. But remember, we talked about fascism, Nazism as imperialistic and militaristic. And Hitler had his sights set on a new world order, one dominated by what he considered to be the pure Aryan race. Now, ironically, he considered the pure Aryan race to be blonde-haired and blue-eyed. He had neither blonde hair nor blue eyes, so I guess all his mirrors were broken. But he did have his sights set beyond the borders of Germany. In March 1938, Hitler's Germany annexes Austria, meaning that they make Austria a part of Germany. Now, there's a long history of kinship between the Austrians and Germans, and in fact, they used to be part of back in the 1800s, used to be part of a coalition of Germanic states until Austria was kicked out. And as I mentioned earlier, where was Hitler born? Hitler was born in Austria. So it wasn't a surprise that Hitler would seek to seize Austria, and he did in March 1938. But of course he would not stop there. He had his sights set on other territories as well. Next, Hitler set his sights on a region in Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. If you take a look at the map, you see the spelling of Sudetenland up there in the right-hand corner of the map. The area highlighted in orange on that map, that's the Sudetenland, the border region of Czechoslovakia. And in that region lived 3 million ethnic Germans. A quick background is that Czechoslovakia didn't exist before World War I. It was a state created out of coming out of World War I, and it's an amalgam of different ethnicities and different groups. So Hitler wanted these Germans in the Sudetenland to be brought into the fold of Germany. So in September 1938, the other leaders in Europe organized a meeting in Munich, city in Germany. Leaders of France, Britain, you see Mussolini is there too, if you take a look at that photo. And they make an agreement with Hitler. The agreement is called the Munich Pact, and in this, Britain and France say to Hitler, to Germany, you can have the Sudetenland, it's yours. But you must promise that your ambitions stop here. You must seek no new territory. Hitler says, great, that's all I want. I'll be happy with the Sudetenland, I'm done, good. So there was the expectation that Hitler would abide by this agreement, keep his word. The Prime Minister of Britain goes back to his country to cheering crowds when his plane lands. He's greeted by the king who shakes his hand. He holds up the Munich Pact and he says, we have ushered in peace in our time. So there was the hope that war had been avoided. But of course it hadn't. By March the following year, by March 1939, Hitler's forces had overtaken all of Czechoslovakia. Not just the Sudetenland, they had taken all of it. So the leaders of Britain and France, they had made a mistake with the Munich Pact, had mistakenly trusted Hitler, but they weren't going to be fooled again, and they sent warnings to Hitler, keep out of Poland. If you set your sights on Poland, that will be a step too far, and we'll be at war. September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. And World War II in Europe has begun. What's the United States doing while this is all going on? The US, of course, has interests in Europe, has allies in Europe. The US President, Franklin Roosevelt, is particularly close to Britain and watches an alarm while Hitler arises in a powerful way as fascism takes hold of Italy and Spain as well. But his hands were tied as the war gets underway. In 1935, President Roosevelt signed, after Congress passed, the Neutrality Act of 1935. And this wasn't the only Neutrality Act. There had been several, and it would be renewed annually. What this Neutrality Act stipulated was that the U.S. must stay out of European wars, must declare its neutrality. This was a response to a couple of things. A response to many Americans' regret at having fought in World War I. But also this was a time of depression in the US. And it seems as if Europe is up to its old tricks, and many Americans did not have the patience. Their attitude was, we have serious problems of our own. Let those damn Europeans fight it out among themselves while we sort out our own problems. So after Britain and France declare war on Germany and Germany reciprocates, the US, by law, declares itself neutral. Another way that America stood on the sidelines while this was going on was by virtue of the Immigration Act of 1924. Right? We talked about that last time. This was the United States closing its doors to immigrants in a substantial way, limiting immigration, putting an annual cap on it, and favoring immigration from places like Britain and other spots in Northern and Western Europe. Well, where is Hitler being aggressive at this point? Austria, Czechoslovakia, and of course Germany as well. Many Jews and others who are trying to flee don't have the option of coming to the United States as a result of these immigration restrictions. Now, some get visas, and Roosevelt looks for ways to work around this. People like Albert Einstein were able to get out of Germany, but of course there were so many who weren't as lucky, especially once the German onslaught ensues. In 1940, German forces run roughshod over Western Europe. The strategy is known as blitzkrieg, which means lightning war, which means hitting those being attacked fast and moving on to the next target, making advantageous use of bombers and light artillery. And as you see, they make their way through the Netherlands, through Belgium, into France. France would surrender, after those in June of 1940. They make their way up to Norway. So who's left to stand against Germany after the Netherlands falls, after Belgium falls, after Norway falls, after France falls? Great Britain stands alone. So in the summer and fall, early fall of 1940, the Battle of Britain ensues. And what this entailed was a massive German bombing campaign of British cities. The goal of these bombing campaigns was to soften up the British for an eventual invasion. But that invasion is first postponed and it never takes place. So the British stand tall, as it were, and survive the Battle of Britain, so to fight another day. But things are looking particularly bleak. Hitler's Germany would make a new enemy in the summer of 1941. That is when Hitler's forces launched Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa was the invasion of the Soviet Union. Now, as I talked about, Hitler hated communism. He called it a Jewish conspiracy. He hated Eastern Europeans. He thought Slavs were inferior. And he set his sights on the rich oil fields in western reaches of the Soviet Union. And he also feared that one day the Soviets might ally with the British and squeeze Germany. And so for a number of reasons, Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa, and the war grows even wider. The worst of the fighting in Europe would take place on this front, between the Soviet forces and the German forces. About half, maybe more, of all the people killed in World War II were in the Soviet Union. So let's return to the United States, and what is the U.S. doing? Well, President Roosevelt is growing increasingly anxious, and he will make several statements to the public and to the Congress, urging them to act. On January 6, 1941, in an address to Congress, Franklin Roosevelt gives one of his most famous and impactful speeches. It's known as the Four Freedoms speech. And in this, even though the U.S. is not a combatant in this war yet, he lays out what's at stake in this war. And he boils it down to what he considers to be four basic freedoms. Freedom of speech, of course that was long gone in Germany and Italy. Freedom of worship, freedom from want, and that means, for want of food, want of basic necessities, and freedom from fear. Now, of course, those people living under fascist regimes lived in fear. So he's trying to make the case that this is a war not just between warring nations, but it's a war of ideas, a war of ideology. And later that year, Congress would act and end American neutrality with the Lend-Lease Act. Now, Americans are not going overseas to fight yet. By the Lend-Lease Act, the USA sends supplies, weapons, to Great Britain, of course the enemy of Hitler's Germany, to China, which is fighting a war against Japan, and also sending supplies to the Soviet Union. Now, the United States and Soviet Union were never friends before this, and they became uneasy allies. But this was a case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Hitler's Germany was considered the greatest threat to world peace at this time, and so the U.S. was going to give aid even to the hated Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin in order to defeat the most immediate and dangerous threat, what they considered to be the most immediate and dangerous threat, and that was Hitler's Germany. Now, with so much attention being paid to what's going on in Europe, unexpectedly, it would be Japan that brings the U.S. into the war. Of course, that attack would take place on December 7th, 1941, at the American naval base Pearl Harbor. Now the United States was at war with Japan. Similar to World War I, where the U.S. stayed out of the war for some time before it was finally dragged in. Now the U.S. was at war with Japan. Why did it go to war with Germany and Italy as well? Well, Germany and Italy were allies of Japan. They had mutual defense agreements. And so when the U.S. declares war on Japan, Germany and Italy declare war on the U.S., and the U.S. reciprocates. So now the U.S. will be at war on several fronts. War against Germany, war against Italy, war against Japan. If World War I was a total war, as we discussed, then World War II was a total war in all caps, total war on steroids, as it dwarfed World War I in every conceivable way. But again, total war has the same basic definition, is that it requires a total commitment to victory. And this was industrialized warfare on a scale never seen before. As part of the strategy, and this was for every warring nation, including the United States and Britain, part of their strategy was to target civilian populations to reduce morale and to destroy their industrial infrastructure so they can't produce bombs and machine guns and tanks to aid their own war effort. Every man, woman, and child was called on to sacrifice in some way, even if it didn't involve picking up a weapon. They can work in a factory, grow a garden. Growing a garden will conserve food for the troops. Participate in a rationing program where they consume only so much meat and butter and coffee a week so that more is saved for the troops. Just as in World War I, but again to a greater extent, government powers expand. There was a draft in the United States. In fact, the draft began even before the U.S. had declared war. We see, even in countries that weren't totalitarian, we see great repression of dissent. We see the use of propaganda and also censorship. The American public did not see a picture of a dead American soldier until 1944 because the U.S. government censored those photos, would not allow them. What changed in 1944? Well, there was the fear among Americans' political and military leadership that Americans were kind of forgetting that the war was going on and kind of losing their commitment. And so it was determined that we'll show them what some of those troops have sacrificed to reinvigorate their sense of commitment. And just as in World War I, there were greater economic controls. Control of the railroad and shipping ways, control of utilities, and so on. Now, as these propaganda posters indicate, they're very much concerned. The U.S. government and the U.S. military were, of course, very much concerned with sensitive information getting into the wrong hands. Loose lips might sink ships. If somebody speaks out of turn, there could be an enemy spy around. And there you see a drowning Navy man saying, "Someone talked," leading to his demise. This one's a little more silly, but the message is a serious one. Loose talk can cost lives. You never know when there might be a big-eared Hitler sitting next to you, or an agent of Hitler. So because there was this fear of internal subversion, the US government would surveil its citizens to a great extent. In May of 1940, keep in mind, May of 1940, this is even before the US entered the war as a combatant, President Franklin Roosevelt authorized the FBI, that's the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to tap telegraph lines and telephone lines. Now, to be clear though, at this point in 1940, only 20% of Americans owned a telephone. So this isn't bulk collection. Though in a sense, I should clarify, in a sense it was, because they would actually tap into the switchboard. At this time, when somebody made a call, they had to first connect to an operator at a switchboard who would then connect them to somebody on the other line. So the FBI would send agents to these switchboards and listen in there. So there's this central place, or there are these central places where calls are connected. And since it was centralized, they could send their agents there to eavesdrop. The man pictured here on this slide is J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI. And he was quite zealous in collecting information on Americans. We'll talk more about him next week. He would build files on thousands of people and groups. Among those monitored were Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, but also an outspoken isolationist and a prominent opponent of U.S. intervention in World War II. Groups like the Women's League for Peace, a pacifist group, was monitored. The NAACP, the African American Civil Rights Group, was also targeted for surveillance. They were monitored as well. And in the context of war, the FBI grew by leaps and bounds. There had only been about a few hundred people in the FBI. During the war, their numbers grew into the thousands. Now, some were concerned with the growth of the FBI. Now, prior to the war, prior to World War II, in the courts, most court decisions had struck down the powers of governments, whether they're local or federal, to eavesdrop, to wiretap without warrants. And I should clarify, I should have earlier, that this surveillance was taking place without warrants. Some grew concerned with these new powers, authorized only by approval of the president, and giving the FBI director, Hoover, carte blanche to monitor whomever he liked. One of those who was concerned was Vice President Harry Truman. Truman would assume the presidency upon the death of Roosevelt in April 1945. The month after assuming office, Truman wrote in his diary, quote, "We want no Gestapo or secret police. FBI is tending in that direction. They are dabbling in sex life scandals, plain blackmail." The FBI would be notorious for this during the Cold War as well. More on that next week. That device pictured there is a dictograph. This was used more by local law enforcement And this dictograph was a short-range tool used by state and local law enforcement to eavesdrop on phone calls. Not quite bulk collection, but done without warrants and picking up nearby signals, regardless of whether somebody is a suspect or not. Even more noteworthy, the U.S. government and military isolated suspected subversives based on ethnicity and country of origin. Italian and German Americans were monitored more closely than, say, somebody from France or Switzerland. Some 31,000 German, Italian, and Japanese Americans were interned under the Enemy Alien Control Program. Some were interrogated, some were deported, some kept in custody for the duration of the war. More notorious is the policy of Japanese internment, because it was on such a massive scale, and it was tinged with no small amount of racism. In 1942, President Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066. And by this order, quote, they will prescribe military areas from which any and all persons may be excluded. So to translate that, there was created this military relocation authority, which was under the authority of the military, that they would pick exclusion areas, areas in which they could pick out people who were suspicious and remove them so that they could not do any mission, do any spying, do any undermining of the war effort. So you see on this map, the exclusion area is the entire west coast of the United States. This program, this relocation program, began as a voluntary relocation program. Then in March 1942, the head of the relocation authority made it compulsory, a forced relocation program. And it targeted Japanese Americans. The Japanese were moved from these exclusion areas on the west coast and moved to internment camps in the interior of the country. You see some of them marked on the map there. The rationale here is that Japanese Americans on the west coast could send signals to the Japanese Navy out in the Pacific Ocean. So instead, they are removed from the west coast, moved to the interior of the country. Some 120,000 Japanese Americans were removed under this relocation program. 2/3 of them have been born in the United States. 120,000 were uprooted from their homes. There they lived in tar paper barracks behind barbed wire. Look at those suspicious characters there. They're up to no good. Another view of an internment camp. The families who were relocated under this program lost homes, lost land, lost farms, lost personal property worth an estimated $400 million that they would never recover. In the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan would apologize and Congress would approve reparations, but of course they would not make up for the property and wealth that was lost. Now, all of this took place despite the fact there was no evidence of any kind of any subversive acts planned or perpetrated by any Japanese Americans. Rumors were rampant, though, and some of those rumors would have a devastating effect. In 1942, a committee under the leadership of a former Supreme Court justice would draft this document. Final report, Japanese evacuation from the West Coast. As noted here, this report was meant to justify the internment policy, to explain it, to make a case for it, to justify it. And this report would be used in a case which challenged the legality, the constitutionality of Japanese internment. A man by the name of Fred Korematsu, you see the spelling there, would challenge this policy, and his challenge would reach the Supreme Court in 1944. The Supreme Court would uphold Japanese internment as a legitimate wartime policy. The Supreme Court referred many times in its decision to this final report from 1942. Well, if there was evidence, then they must have been justified, right? Bullshit. This report was cooked. This report was full of misinformation and falsehoods. To give you a couple of examples, the report says that as Japanese were being removed from the West Coast and the FBI is going in and investigating, this report asserts that 60,000 rounds of ammo and many rifles, shotguns, and maps were collected from the Japanese who were being relocated. Sounds like somebody's about to start some trouble, right? That's a lot of ammunition. It's a lot of rifles. And what do they need these maps for? Well, they're probably picking out targets, right? What the report left out is that all that was collected from a sporting goods store owned by a Japanese American. Sounds like somebody was trying to make a case, whether the case was there or not. Furthermore, this final report asserts that illicit radio transmissions were sent from the West Coast to the Japanese Navy in the Pacific leading up to the attack at Pearl Harbor. But both the FBI and the Federal Communications Commission, which is in charge of regulating the airwaves, both of them debunked that claim, said it's not true. But it stayed in the report anyway and was used in a Supreme Court decision in Korematsu v. United States. So sometimes surveillance can lead to overreach, especially when it's motivated by extreme paranoia. Now, of course, there was justified fear in this case, as opposed to, say, the Salem witch trials, but they believed in witches. Real fear can be blown out of proportion and used to humiliate, degrade, certain groups of people, deprive them of property, incarcerate them. Now, in Germany, we see a more extreme form of this, of groups actually concentrated for the purposes of mass extermination. This, of course, did not reach that level. It's an ironic fact of World War II that the most decorated unit in the American military during the war was a Japanese-American unit. One way for internees at these camps to be released, there were a few ways. For example, if they had family in the center of the country on the East Coast, they could negotiate a way out of the camp. If they're of age and they go to college, that's another way out. Another was to join the military, as some of them did. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which saw action in Italy, a Japanese-American force, was the most decorated unit in World War II. So speaking of the war, let's get back to what was happening on the battlefield and see the war to its conclusion. Possibly the most significant battle in Europe during World War II was the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad is in the Soviet Union. In August of 1942, the Germans began laying siege to the city of Stalingrad, surrounding it, bombarding it, and the situation grows terribly desperate in Stalingrad. The death toll is in the tens of thousands, people reduced to eating rats. But the Soviet forces and ordinary people fight back, continue to fight back, so that by February 1943, the Germans actually start retreating, moving backwards. So at great cost, you might describe the Battle of Stalingrad as a Soviet victory. And the Germans start moving backwards from the Eastern Front. It's also in 1942 that the U.S. joins the fray. The first spot in the war against the Germans and Italians that U.S. troops saw action was in North Africa. Africa had been divided up among the European powers. Germans had taken French possessions and British possessions in Africa. And in order to get Americans' troops' feet wet, their leadership drew up what was known as a peripheral strategy. It was too soon to hit Germany directly, except from the air. The bombing campaign was constant. So first they send troops to North Africa, then the campaign in Italy, Sicily, and then mainland Italy, the boot. Then, by the spring of 1944, it was time for the invasion of Europe. Famously known as D-Day, the codename was Operation Overlord, June 6, 1944. The largest amphibious force in world history makes its way to France, where they set ashore, beat heavy resistance from the Germans, but eventually overcome that resistance. D-Day has been dramatized in many a film. Saving Private Ryan. There's a movie called D-Day, The Longest Day, The Big Red One, and so on. So now, to put this in the context, this is 1944. So the Battle of Stalingrad is in the rearview mirror, and the Germans are being pushed backward from east to west. Now you have this massive landing force of Americans, Brits, and Canadians landing in the west. So now you have British and Americans and Canadians and French advancing from the west. You have the Soviets advancing from the east to squeeze Germany in the middle. August 25th, 1944, Paris is liberated. So the American British forces are getting closer and closer to Germany. April the following year, April 1945, the Soviet Army enters Berlin. The end of that month, Hitler and many of his closest allies, closest advisors, commit suicide. On May 8th, 1945, Germany surrenders. That is Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. Victory in Europe, that's cause for celebration, right? The Nazi Empire has fallen. Germany has surrendered. But World War II is not over, of course. It would take something else to bring the war in the Pacific to an end, to force the surrender of the Japanese. It would take the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb was developed through a program known as the Manhattan Project, which began in 1942. This was an effort to create the deadliest weapons ever known, splitting the atom and causing massive explosions. One of the more famous sites for the development of these weapons was at Los Alamos in New Mexico. And there's a sign there. You see security. Keeping secrets was, of course, was paramount. Hold your tongue, the job's not done. Silence still means security. Trying to reinforce that message that this task was too great for it to be compromised with the spilling of secrets. But Los Alamos was not the only site. Also Oak Ridge, Tennessee site, and Hanford, Washington State. Now, despite the efforts of security to keep the Manhattan Project secret, there were spies in their midst. And these were spies not for Germany, which was, of course, America's enemy during World War II. They were communist spies, spies on behalf of the Soviet Union in the Manhattan Project. The Soviet Union, to remind you, was America's ally at this time. They shared the common enemy of Hitler's Germany. But they still wanted to eavesdrop on the United States. And so Soviet spies in Britain first send the word to the Soviet Union that the United States is developing this technology. And by the way, the US was inspired to do this by Albert Einstein. The Germans had been attempting to develop this technology, though they would abandon the effort to develop atomic weapons. Albert Einstein wrote a letter to Franklin Roosevelt warning him about Germany's efforts, and that would inspire the US to get the ball rolling. It's believed that spies in Britain first sent word when they learned through their British contacts, first sent word to the Soviet Union that the United States was developing this deadly technology. And so communist agents in the US began to recruits. 3 of the people pictured here, not the woman, though she would actually be executed for spying, but the 3 men on this slide were all communist spies embedded in the Manhattan Project. The young man in the round glasses to the left of the slide, that is Klaus Fuchs, Fuchs. He was actually born in Germany, but he left Germany and settled in England well before World War II. Eventually makes his way to the United States, he's a physicist, is involved in the Manhattan Project, and sends information back to the Soviet Union. The man in the mustache with the glasses, that is Julius Rosenberg, who was a spy at Oak Ridge facility. Then beneath him is brother and sister, David Greenglass and Ethel Greenglass. David Greenglass was also a spy, communist spy for the Soviet Union. He was stationed at Oak Ridge and Los Alamos. Now, while the war is going on, the U.S. is not aware that these men are spies. There are others, suspicious characters who are removed from the Manhattan Project or taken into custody. But these spies are not identified until after World War II, and we will talk about them next time. Despite the efforts of communists to monitor the program, it would of course proceed. Now, the goal of these spies was not to prevent the U.S. from developing these weapons, but rather to report back to the Soviet Union and also give them some clue about how this is done. In fact, in 1949, the Soviet Union would explode its first atomic weapons. But before that happens, the United States would successfully test its own atomic weapon and eventually use them to bring the war against Japan to an end. August 6th, 1945, the Japanese city of Hiroshima is the first victim of an atomic bomb. In the blink of an eye, 70,000 people are killed after the detonation. And you see the impact of the bomb, the destruction of the landscape and the structures and the stacked bodies. Over the next several days, another 40,000 would die from wounds, from radiation poisoning. One bomb kills over 100,000 people. Now, to be clear, there had been deadlier bombing runs in this war. Some of them against Germany. Those took hundreds, sometimes thousands of bombs to achieve the kind of deadly results that one bomb achieved on August 6, 1945. So this was not unusual for this particular war. As I said earlier, civilians were specifically targeted. And not just in something like the Holocaust, which was an effort at racial extermination of a people. All sides in World War II took it upon them as a war strategy to target civilians, to reduce their morale, reduce their support for the war, and to destroy the infrastructure of their enemies. This was an escalation of what had already been taking place. 3 days later, second bomb would be dropped on the Japanese city of Nagasaki, killing another 70,000 people. August 9th, 1945. Finally, Japan would surrender on August 14th. V-Day Day. May 8th was VE Day, victory in Europe. August 14th, VJ Day, victory in Japan. So now the war was over on all fronts. But of course, not before there was an almost incalculable cost to this. The human cost from the wars between 1939 to 45, an estimated 60 to 70 million killed. For comparison, in World War I, 16 million died. In this war, 60 to 70 million. And as you see, the majority of the people killed were non-combatants. In other words, they weren't soldiers, they weren't sailors, they weren't airmen, they weren't pilots. This was largely a result of the bombing strategy that I just talked about. But of course, it also had to do with just the normal deprivations of war. Food isn't able to get to towns and cities, people are displaced, infrastructure breaks down. Then on top of that, there was also the Holocaust and some of the atrocities that Japan committed in China, which were racially motivated attempts to destroy people and subdue them. The deadliest war in human history. That's what I mean when I said this is a total war, but compared to World War I, the Second World War dwarfs World War I in every way, especially when you look at the toll of it. And in a war of this scale, as these numbers indicate, ordinary people are wrapped up in it. That's what total war involves. And of course, ordinary people are surveilled by their governments, whether it's a police state like the Communist Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, or fascist, or even more democratic places like Britain, United States. Government powers grow, the surveillance state expands because the stakes are so high. And the invention of atomic weapons raises those stakes even further, and they would cast a shadow over the decades to follow what becomes known as the Cold War. That's next week's topic. For this week's discussion, you'll be looking at the emergence of spying as a weapon in World War II in a more organized fashion. And the man pictured here, William Donovan, was a central figure in the development of the group called the OSS, which is the precursor to our CIA. So that'll be the basis of your discussion. So I look forward to your comments and questions and responses to my questions in the discussion board. Next week, our last week, we will pick up the story and carry it through the Cold War.